Hello and welcome to Nightmare Lullabies. As you settle in for the night, prepare to be immersed in a world of eerie whispers and unsettling tales, designed to both chill and soothe. Now close your eyes, relax, and let the darkness carry you away. And if these nightly tales captivate you, feel free to join our community for more whispered secrets. The assassination of Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme on February 28, 1986, remains one of the most infamous unsolved crimes in modern European history. The shocking murder took place on a quiet Stockholm street and plunged the nation into decades of speculation, theories, and investigative dead ends. For more than 30 years, detectives, journalists, and the Swedish public have searched for answers. Who pulled the trigger that fateful night? And perhaps more importantly, why? Olof Palme was a divisive yet deeply influential political figure in Sweden. As the leader of the Swedish Social Democratic Party, he had served as prime minister from 1969 to 1976, and then again from 1982 until his death. Known for his strong stance on international human rights, his vocal opposition to apartheid in South Africa, and his criticism of U.S. foreign policies during the Vietnam War, Palme was a leader who made powerful allies and formidable enemies. His murder raised immediate suspicions that his political ideologies had played a role in his untimely death. On the evening of February 28, Palme and his wife, Lisbeth, decided to enjoy a night out. They had made a spontaneous decision to go to the cinema with their son, Martin, and his girlfriend. Unlike most heads of state, Palme often walked around Stockholm without security detail. That night, he declined police protection, as he frequently did, choosing instead to stroll freely with Lisbeth through the city's streets. The lack of security would prove to be a critical factor in what was about to unfold. After the film ended around 11 p.m., the couple began walking home along Sveavägen, one of Stockholm's main streets. It was a cold winter night, with the streets relatively quiet. At approximately 11:21 p.m., as they reached the corner of Sveavägen and Tunnelgaten, a gunman approached from behind and fired 2 shots. One bullet struck Olof Palme in the back, piercing vital organs before exiting his body. The second bullet grazed Lisbeth Palme. Olof collapsed onto the pavement while his wife, in a state of shock, screamed for help. The assailant, described by some witnesses as a tall man wearing a dark coat, calmly turned and disappeared into a side alley, vanishing into the Stockholm night. Despite the presence of multiple witnesses, the attack had been swift and methodical, leaving behind no immediate clues as to the killer's identity. Within minutes, bystanders rushed to the Prime Minister's aid, but the damage was already done. Olof Palme was pronounced dead upon arrival at the hospital. News of the assassination spread rapidly, plunging Sweden into mourning and disbelief. The killing of a national leader on an open street without any immediate suspects was unheard of in the country's modern history. Swedish authorities quickly launched one of the most extensive manhunts ever seen, but the investigation would soon take unexpected and frustrating turns. Despite witness descriptions and an extensive police operation, the initial phase of the investigation was plagued by mismanagement. The crime scene was not properly secured, potential evidence was contaminated, and early witness statements were inconsistently recorded. As hours turned into days and days into weeks, the urgency to find the assassin led to a series of rushed arrests, false leads, and numerous conflicting theories. Who was responsible for this shocking assassination? Was it a politically motivated act carried out by an intelligence agency, a lone extremist, or a criminal organization? Or was it the work of an unstable individual who saw an opportunity and took it? These questions have haunted Sweden for decades, and despite years of investigation, no definitive answers have been found. In the coming chapters, we will explore the different suspects, theories, and the flawed investigation that followed the murder of Olof Palme. The search for his killer spans multiple countries, involves intelligence agencies, underground movements, and a tangled web of speculation. This is the story of a case that, to this day, remains one of the greatest mysteries in European history. In the aftermath of Olof Palme's assassination, Sweden found itself in a state of shock and disbelief. The killing of a sitting prime minister on an open street, with no immediate arrests or clear suspects, was an unprecedented event in the nation's modern history. Within hours, Stockholm's streets were flooded with police officers, forensic experts, and journalists, all scrambling to make sense of what had just happened. The sense of urgency was overwhelming, but the investigation quickly spiraled into confusion. One of the most immediate challenges was the handling of the crime scene. The intersection of Sveavägen and Tunnelgatan, where Palme had been shot, was not properly secured in the critical moments after the attack. Pedestrians and police officers unknowingly trampled over what could have been crucial forensic evidence. Witnesses who had been near the scene were interviewed, but their testimonies varied widely. Some reported seeing a lone gunman walking calmly away, while others recalled hearing a car speed off in the distance. The descriptions of the suspect were inconsistent, making it difficult to construct a solid profile. The police faced immense pressure to produce results quickly. The Swedish public was demanding answers, and government officials feared the possibility of a larger conspiracy. Within days, dozens of individuals were questioned, some arrested, but none provided any substantial leads. The lack of a clear suspect led to widespread speculation. Was the assassination politically motivated? Could it have been the work of a domestic extremist? Or was there a foreign intelligence operation involved? In the days following the murder, several key witnesses came forward with accounts of what they had seen that night. A man named Lars Jeppsson claimed to have seen a figure loitering near the crime scene just minutes before the shooting. Another witness, a taxi driver who had been parked near the intersection, described a man running down Tunnelgatan in the moments after the shots were fired. However, despite these testimonies, no solid suspect emerged. The lack of clear physical evidence, no fingerprints, no murder weapon, and no DNA, left investigators grasping at straws. As the days turned into weeks, the investigation began to lose momentum. The Stockholm police force, unaccustomed to handling crimes of this magnitude, struggled with organization and efficiency. Misinformation spread rapidly, and internal conflicts within the investigative team further hampered progress. Different factions within the police disagreed on whether the killing was a professional hit or the work of a lone gunman with personal motives. This lack of direction led to one of the most controversial aspects of the investigation: the focus on Christer Pettersson. Christer Pettersson was a known criminal with a history of violent behavior and substance abuse. He was arrested in December 1988 after being identified by Lisbeth Palme, who claimed he bore a striking resemblance to the man she saw that night. The case against Pettersson, however, was circumstantial at best. No physical evidence linked him to the crime, and the prosecution's argument relied heavily on Lisbeth's testimony. Despite this, Pettersson was convicted in 1989, only for the verdict to be overturned a year later due to lack of concrete evidence. His acquittal deepened the public's frustration, and the case remained unresolved. With Pettersson ruled out, the investigation once again found itself at a dead end. Over the years, multiple theories emerged, some more plausible than others. Theories about international involvement gained traction, particularly given Palme's controversial foreign policies. Some speculated that the CIA, South African intelligence agencies, or Kurdish militant groups could have been behind the killing. However, no credible evidence ever surfaced to support these claims. Despite countless investigations, task forces, and re-examinations, the murder of Olof Palme remains a haunting mystery. The failure to secure critical evidence in the early stages of the investigation had irreparably damaged the chances of solving the case. Even as forensic science advanced over the years, the lack of physical evidence made it nearly impossible to apply new investigative techniques effectively. Decades later, in June 2020, Swedish authorities announced that they had identified a likely suspect: Stig Engström, also known as the Skandier Man. Engström had been near the crime scene on the night of the assassination and had provided inconsistent statements to police. He had long been suspected by some investigators, but was never formally charged. By the time authorities officially named him as their primary suspect, Engström had been dead for 20 years. With no way to prosecute him, the case was declared closed, though lingering doubts remained. Even with this conclusion, many people in Sweden and beyond remain unsatisfied. The lack of definitive evidence, the mishandling of the original investigation, and the failure to convict anyone in a court of law have all contributed to the sense that justice was never truly served. The assassination of Olof Palme continues to be a source of speculation, discussion, and controversy. The unanswered questions still haunt Sweden. Who really killed Olof Palme? Was it truly Stig Engström, acting alone, or is there another layer to the mystery that remains buried? The case may have been officially closed, but for many, the truth remains elusive. Until definitive evidence emerges, the killing of Sweden's prime minister will remain one of the most perplexing political assassinations of the modern era. As the years passed, the assassination of Olof Palme continued to loom over Sweden like an unresolved scar. With each passing decade, new investigators, journalists, and conspiracy theorists attempted to piece together what truly happened on that cold night in February 1986. However, the deeper they dug, the more tangled the mystery became. One of the prevailing frustrations surrounding the case was the extent of the initial mismanagement. The failure to secure crucial evidence in the aftermath of the crime had left investigators with a puzzle that was missing far too many pieces. Witness testimonies had been inconsistent, the crime scene had been disturbed, and no physical evidence, such as the murder weapon or forensic traces, had been found. Without these key elements, police had been forced to rely on speculation, circumstantial evidence, and eyewitness accounts that varied significantly from one another. Over the years, the case produced a long list of suspects. Some were individuals with direct or indirect connections to the crime, while others were nothing more than names pulled from conspiracy theories. Among these suspects was a man named Victor Gunnarsson, a right-wing extremist known for his harsh criticism of Palme's policies. He was briefly arrested, but later released due to a complete lack of evidence. Then there were suspicions about possible international involvement, particularly from intelligence agencies that had been opposed to Palme's vocal anti-apartheid stance and his criticism of U.S. foreign policy. Some theorists suggested that the assassination had been carried out by operatives from the CIA, MI6, or South African intelligence. However, none of these theories ever resulted in actionable evidence. Among the more bizarre theories that surfaced was the idea that a rogue faction within the Swedish police force had conspired to eliminate Palme. This theory gained traction due to reports of extreme right-wing elements within the Swedish security services who viewed Palme as a traitor. Some speculated that these individuals had worked together to carry out the assassination and then deliberately sabotaged the investigation to ensure that the truth would never come to light. Although compelling, this theory remained largely speculative and was never proven beyond conjecture. Perhaps the most confounding element of the case was the murder weapon. The firearm used to kill Palme was identified as a .357 Magnum revolver, a powerful weapon often associated with professional assassins. Despite extensive searches, the gun was never recovered. The absence of the murder weapon meant that there was no way to match it to a suspect, further complicating the investigation. Several weapons of the same make and model were tested, but none were determined to be the one used in the crime. As the years turned into decades, the case remained open, but interest in solving it fluctuated. Every few years, a new lead or revelation would reignite public interest, only for it to fade again when no tangible progress was made. Journalists and independent investigators continued their work, sifting through archives, interviewing former police officials, and pursuing theories that had long been dismissed by authorities. Some believed that the key to solving the case lay in the international community, while others insisted that the truth had been buried within Sweden's own borders. By the early 2000s, the case had become one of the longest-running murder investigations in history. The Swedish government remained under pressure to resolve it, but with so much time having passed, the odds of a breakthrough seemed slim. Then, in 2020, a dramatic development brought the case back into the headlines. Swedish authorities officially named Stig Engström, the so-called Skandier man, as their prime suspect. Engström had worked at the Skandier insurance company, located near the crime scene, and had provided conflicting statements about his whereabouts on the night of the murder. Some investigators believed that he had fabricated his version of events in an attempt to insert himself into the investigation and manipulate public perception. However, Engström had died in 2000, meaning he could never be brought to trial. While the authorities claimed that the evidence pointed to him as the likely assassin, skeptics argued that the decision to close the case based on circumstantial evidence alone was unsatisfying. Was Engström truly the killer, or had authorities simply sought closure by naming him as the perpetrator without definitive proof? Many believed that the true killer was still unknown, and that the case remained as open-ended as ever. Despite the official closure, the murder of Olof Palme continues to fuel debates, books, documentaries, and research efforts. Some insist that the truth is still out there, waiting to be uncovered. Others believe that Sweden may never truly know who was responsible for the assassination of their prime minister. Even today, as the years continue to pass, one question lingers in the minds of those who remember that fateful night. Did justice slip through Sweden's fingers, or was the truth buried long ago, destined never to be revealed? Decades after the murder of Olof Palme, the case continues to cast a long shadow over Sweden's political and legal history. Despite the official closure of the investigation with the naming of Stig Engström as the likely killer, doubts still persist. Many Swedes believe the truth is far more complex than the final explanation given by authorities. What if the real killer had been overlooked? What if the investigation had been intentionally misled? These lingering uncertainties have kept the mystery alive, fueling theories, debates, and ongoing research into one of the greatest unsolved political assassinations in modern history. The failure to conclusively solve Palme's murder left a deep mark on Sweden's justice system. The investigation's missteps and the inability to produce conclusive evidence for so many years shook public confidence in law enforcement. The case became infamous not just for the assassination itself, but for the botched attempts to uncover the perpetrator. Errors were made from the very beginning. Forensic evidence was not properly collected, witness accounts were disorganized, and early leads were pursued without sufficient scrutiny. By the time authorities had realized their mistakes, valuable time had been lost, and crucial evidence had likely disappeared forever. Many critics of the official findings argue that the decision to pin the crime on Stig Engström was an easy way to bring closure to a case that had long been a source of embarrassment for Swedish authorities. Engström had been dead for 2 decades by the time he was named the prime suspect, meaning he could never be tried or provide a defense. Without a confession or physical evidence tying him directly to the scene, doubts linger about whether he was truly responsible. Could Engström have been a convenient scapegoat, selected to allow authorities to close the case without solving it? Another major point of contention is the role of international involvement. Olof Palme's foreign policies had made him a controversial figure on the world stage. He had openly criticized both the Soviet Union and the United States, opposed apartheid in South Africa, and supported peace movements that challenged the global status quo. Some have theorized that his assassination was orchestrated by a foreign intelligence agency, perhaps the CIA, the KGB, or South African operatives seeking revenge for his vocal opposition to their government. Yet, despite compelling circumstantial arguments, no solid evidence has ever surfaced linking his death to an international conspiracy. A particularly intriguing theory revolves around the role of Swedish police and intelligence agencies. Some insiders have suggested that right-wing factions within Sweden's security forces saw Palme as a threat to national interests and sought to remove him. Reports emerged that certain individuals within law enforcement had discussed their disdain for the prime minister and had access to the kind of weaponry used in the assassination. While this theory remains unproven, it highlights the deep divisions within Sweden at the time and the possibility that internal political struggles played a role in Palme's murder. Despite these persistent theories, no one has been able to provide irrefutable proof pointing to an alternative suspect. Over the years, many amateur investigators, journalists, and private researchers have continued their search for new evidence, combing through old reports, witness statements, and forensic details in an effort to uncover what law enforcement could not. Some claim to have found inconsistencies in the testimonies of key figures, while others insist that new forensic techniques could still be applied to re-examine crucial elements of the case. However, with decades having passed since that fateful night, the likelihood of a breakthrough seems to grow slimmer with each year. In the end, the murder of Olof Palme remains a cautionary tale, one of justice delayed and perhaps justice denied. It serves as a reminder of how even the most high-profile crimes can go unsolved when evidence is mishandled and investigative efforts falter. Theories will continue to circulate, new suspects may emerge, and researchers will persist in their quest for the truth. But as of now, the true identity of Palme's assassin remains unknown. As Sweden moves forward, the case remains an open wound, a historical event that shaped the nation's relationship with its government, law enforcement, and the very concept of justice. Whether or not the real killer will ever be unmasked remains one of the greatest questions in European criminal history. Until then, the mystery of Olof Palme's assassination remains just that, a mystery. As the years continued to pass, the assassination of Olof Palme remained one of the most confounding mysteries in modern history. Despite decades of investigative efforts, new leads, and the official declaration that Stig Engström, the so-called Skandier man, was the likely perpetrator, many remained unconvinced. For those who had followed the case closely, it seemed that every answer only led to more questions. Public skepticism over Engström's guilt was understandable. His name had surfaced in the early years of the investigation, but he was never considered a serious suspect at the time. His erratic behavior, inconsistent statements, and desire for media attention made him a peculiar figure in the case, but many doubted that he had the means, motive, or ability to carry out such a high-profile assassination alone. Critics pointed out that without conclusive forensic evidence or eyewitness testimony placing him at the scene with a weapon, the case against Engström was largely circumstantial. Swedish authorities defended their decision to close the case, arguing that new analysis of old evidence and psychological profiling pointed to Engström as the most plausible suspect. However, many legal experts and true crime analysts found the conclusion unsatisfying. Engström's suicide in 2000 meant he could never be interrogated or tried, and without a confession, his alleged involvement remained speculative at best. Was this truly the work of a lone individual, or had the real killer managed to elude justice for decades? Beyond Engström, other theories persisted. Some investigators believed the murder had connections to international intelligence agencies. Palme had been an outspoken critic of major global powers, including the United States, the Soviet Union, and South Africa's apartheid regime. His vocal opposition to these entities had made him a controversial figure on the world stage. Some speculated that his assassination had been a covert operation, orchestrated to silence him and send a message. However, no concrete proof had ever surfaced linking his death to a foreign power. Another prevailing theory pointed to Swedish right-wing extremists and members of the country's security services. In the years leading up to Palme's assassination, his political stance had been met with increasing hostility from conservative factions within Sweden. Reports surfaced that elements within the police force harbored deep-seated resentment toward Palme, viewing him as a destabilizing force within the country. Some suggested that a rogue faction within law enforcement could have played a role in the killing, either by aiding the assassin or obstructing the subsequent investigation to ensure that the truth remained buried. Further complicating the case were claims of botched police work and political interference. Early mismanagement of the crime scene, the failure to secure key evidence, and the inconsistent handling of witness testimonies cast a long shadow over the investigation. Even as forensic science advanced, much of the crucial evidence had been lost or contaminated in the critical first hours following the murder. This lack of forensic integrity left investigators with limited options as they revisited the case over the decades. Despite the frustration surrounding the case, the murder of Olof Palme became a case study in criminal investigations, political intrigue, and the dangers of unresolved justice. Books, documentaries, and investigative reports continued to examine the details, hoping to shed new light on the elusive truth. Conspiracy theorists, historians, and amateur detectives all contributed to the ongoing discourse, each offering their own interpretations and insights. For Sweden, Palme's assassination represented more than just the loss of a political leader. It was a national trauma. The country, known for its peace and stability, had never experienced an event of this magnitude. The shock of losing a prime minister in such a brutal and public manner left a lasting impact on Swedish society, creating a collective sense of unease that lingered for generations. Despite the closure of the official investigation, the mystery remains alive. There are those who believe that the real answers still lie hidden, waiting for a critical piece of evidence or a long-held secret to be revealed. Will the true assassin ever be definitively identified, or will the murder of Olof Palme forever remain an unsolved enigma, lost to the passage of time? The case remains an enduring symbol of unresolved justice. For those who seek answers, the search continues. Until the truth is uncovered, the question of who killed Olof Palme will remain one of history's most haunting and unresolved mysteries. As the years stretched on, the case of Olof Palme's assassination remained an open wound in Sweden's national consciousness. Even as Swedish authorities officially named a suspect and closed the investigation, the questions surrounding Palme's murder continued to haunt investigators, journalists, and the public. The passage of time had done little to provide the closure so many had hoped for. Despite the official ruling in 2020 that pointed to Stig Engström, many experts remained unconvinced. Critics argued that Engström, while an eccentric character, lacked the clear motive and means to orchestrate such a precise and clean assassination. Some believed he had merely been a desperate man seeking attention, inserting himself into the case to gain notoriety. Others suspected that he had been a convenient scapegoat, allowing authorities to close a case that had become a national embarrassment. Meanwhile, alternative theories gained traction, with some researchers delving deeper into the idea that Palme had been the target of a much larger and more sophisticated plot. Theories ranged from organized crime involvement to allegations that Palme had been silenced due to his opposition to certain geopolitical agendas. Sweden's neutral stance in global conflicts and Palme's sharp criticism of both the West and the Soviet Union had made him a controversial figure on the world stage. Could his assassination have been carried out by foreign intelligence operatives, perhaps with the assistance of local collaborators? If so, why had no conclusive evidence ever surfaced to confirm this theory? Another persistent theory revolved around the South African intelligence services. Palme had been an outspoken critic of apartheid, and his government had been heavily involved in sanctioning South Africa's racist regime. Some suspected that South African operatives, fearing Palme's influence in cutting off international support for their government, had arranged his assassination. While Sweden's investigation explored this possibility, no hard proof ever emerged to validate it, leaving it as another unsolved thread in the case's tangled web. As with many high-profile political assassinations, conspiracy theories continued to thrive. Some suggested that elements within Sweden's own government had orchestrated the killing, possibly fearing that Palme's policies threatened the status quo. Palme's economic and social policies had polarized Sweden's political landscape, making him a target for those who believed his leadership was steering the country in the wrong direction. Could rogue elements within the Swedish police or security services have played a role in his murder? This theory, while compelling, remained speculative, as no direct links were ever established. Despite all these possibilities, one undeniable fact remained. The investigation had been plagued by missteps from the very beginning. The crime scene had been mishandled, critical witness testimonies had been inconsistently recorded, and suspects had been identified and dismissed without definitive conclusions. The Palme case became a textbook example of how a poorly managed investigation could derail the pursuit of justice. Even as technology advanced and forensic science improved, the absence of definitive physical evidence, such as the murder weapon or DNA, meant that solving the case relied heavily on witness testimonies and circumstantial theories. In the years following the case's closure, a sense of resignation settled over much of the Swedish public. While many continued to follow new developments and theories, others accepted that the truth might never fully be known. Some believed that too much time had passed, and that even if new evidence were to emerge, it might not be enough to provide a definitive resolution. Yet, despite the decades that had passed, there were still those who refused to let the mystery die. Independent investigators, journalists, and true crime enthusiasts continued to pore over the details, searching for overlooked clues or inconsistencies that might one day lead to a breakthrough. Some even hoped that advancements in artificial intelligence and forensic technologies might eventually succeed where traditional methods had failed, uncovering hidden connections and exposing new suspects. The assassination of Olof Palme remains one of the most haunting unresolved crimes in modern European history. It is a reminder that even in the most developed and orderly societies, justice is not always guaranteed. The case stands as a testament to the complexities of political power, the fragility of investigative processes, and the enduring impact of unanswered questions. Will the truth ever be uncovered, or will the name of Palme's true assassin remain lost to history? Until irrefutable evidence emerges, The case of Olof Palme will continue to be one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of the 20th century. As the investigation into Olof Palme's assassination stretched into decades, it became one of the most extensive and expensive criminal probes in European history. With over 10,000 individuals questioned and more than 130 potential suspects named over the years, the case had grown into a labyrinth of conflicting testimonies, dead-end leads, and unresolved speculation. Sweden, a nation known for its order and efficiency, found itself struggling under the weight of an unsolvable crime. One of the most frustrating aspects of the case was the absence of the murder weapon. Investigators had determined that Palme had been shot with a .357 Magnum revolver, a powerful firearm capable of inflicting a fatal wound with just one shot. Despite countless searches, inquiries, and forensic advancements, the actual weapon had never been found. Several guns of the same make and model were tested, but none matched the ballistics from the crime scene. Without the weapon, investigators had little physical evidence to tie any suspect to the murder. Meanwhile, theories surrounding the killing continued to evolve. Some continued to argue that Palme had been the victim of an international conspiracy. His strong stance against apartheid, his criticism of NATO, and his ties to socialist movements around the world had made him a controversial figure. If foreign intelligence services had been involved, as some believed, the lack of evidence could be explained by the expertise of trained operatives who knew how to cover their tracks. Another intriguing theory focused on the role of organized crime. Sweden had seen a rise in international criminal activities in the 1980s, and some investigators considered the possibility that Palme's assassination had been a contract killing. However, this theory lacked a clear motive. Palme was not known to have direct conflicts with criminal organizations, and unlike leaders in other countries, he had not declared war on the underworld in a way that would have justified such a bold attack. While speculation ran rampant, the Swedish public began to lose faith in the authorities' ability to solve the case. Investigative journalists took matters into their own hands, publishing reports that challenged the official findings and offering alternative theories that had been overlooked by the police. Some of these independent investigations pointed to inconsistencies in witness testimonies and discrepancies in how key pieces of evidence had been handled. One such inconsistency involved a mysterious man seen running from the crime scene moments after the assassination. Witnesses described him as wearing a dark coat, moving quickly down Tunnelgaten, but his identity was never confirmed. Some theorists believed he was an accomplice, while others suspected he was the actual shooter. Despite multiple witness reports, the man was never identified, adding yet another layer of mystery to the case. By the 2010s, the assassination of Olof Palme had become a case study in investigative failures. Despite new forensic tools and modern crime-solving techniques, there remained no definitive answer to who had fired the fatal shot. The lack of closure took a toll on Sweden's justice system, with many arguing that the government's reluctance to explore certain leads had hindered the investigation from the start. In 2020, Swedish authorities made the unprecedented decision to officially close the case, naming Stig Engström as the likely assassin. Engström had been a known figure in the investigation, but no concrete evidence had ever placed him at the scene with a weapon. The decision to identify him as the killer, but take no further action, only deepened public skepticism. If Engström had truly been responsible, why had it taken decades to reach that conclusion? And if he was innocent, had the real killer managed to evade justice forever? As Sweden came to terms with the case's closure, one undeniable truth remained. The murder of Olof Palme was more than just an unsolved crime. It had become part of the nation's history, a lingering enigma that continued to inspire debate, speculation, and frustration. Some continued to hold out hope that new evidence might one day emerge, while others accepted that the truth might never be known. The case of Olof Palme's assassination serves as a reminder of how even the most powerful figures can fall victim to acts of violence, and how even the most diligent investigations can fail to provide justice. The mystery remains, etched into Sweden's collective memory, a question mark in the annals of history that may never be answered. As Sweden moved into the 2020s, the assassination of Olof Palme continued to be one of the most hotly debated topics in the country's history. Though officially closed by authorities, The case had left too many unanswered questions to simply fade into obscurity. Researchers, journalists, and amateur investigators refused to accept the final conclusion, arguing that too many inconsistencies remained and too many alternative theories had never been fully explored. One of the key unresolved issues was the timeline of events immediately following the shooting. According to witness statements, the shooter disappeared into the alleyway off Tunnelgaten within seconds of firing the fatal shots. However, conflicting accounts about his direction of escape led to confusion. Some claimed to have seen him running toward Momskilnadsgaten, while others suggested he may have doubled back toward Sveavigen. The lack of surveillance cameras at the time meant that his movements after the shooting remained speculative at best. Further complicating matters was the apparent delay in securing the crime scene. In the chaotic moments following the attack, bystanders rushed to Palme's side, while police officers struggled to piece together what had just occurred. This led to potential evidence being compromised or lost entirely. The failure to immediately cordon off the area and systematically collect forensic evidence was seen as a major blunder, one that many believed had irreparably damaged the investigation. As years passed, more theories surfaced regarding possible motivations for Palme's assassination. Some believed that he had been targeted due to his work in international politics. His vocal opposition to apartheid in South Africa, his efforts to mediate conflicts in the Middle East, and his independent stance on Cold War diplomacy had made him a figure of contention on the global stage. Could his assassination have been the result of foreign intelligence operations, seeking to eliminate a leader who threatened certain geopolitical interests? Others pointed to Sweden's own domestic issues at the time. The country had been grappling with political tensions, economic uncertainty, and increasing divisions between left and right-wing factions. Palme's leadership had been both celebrated and criticized, making him a polarizing figure. Some speculated that a domestic extremist group, or even individuals within the Swedish security forces, may have played a role in his assassination. The mystery surrounding the murder weapon also continued to frustrate investigators. Despite extensive searches and appeals to the public, the .357 Magnum revolver used in the attack was never recovered. Given that Sweden had strict gun control laws, the presence of such a weapon raised suspicions. Where had it come from? Had it been disposed of immediately after the crime, or had it been hidden away, waiting to be discovered? The lack of a murder weapon meant that forensic breakthroughs, such as matching the bullet to a specific firearm, were impossible. While the official investigation had named Stig Engström as the likely assassin, skeptics continued to question whether he truly had the capability to carry out such a calculated killing. Engström, a graphic designer who worked at the nearby Skandia insurance building, had inserted himself into the investigation early on, providing inconsistent accounts of his whereabouts that night. Yet, many believed that he lacked the training or composure to commit such a precise and rapid execution before evading capture. If Engström had not been the shooter, then who had? And if he had acted alone, how had he managed to escape undetected in the moments following the crime? The possibility of an accomplice, someone who had helped plan the assassination or facilitated Engström's movements, was another avenue that had never been fully explored. Some researchers believed that Engström had been part of a larger conspiracy, but had ultimately been used as a scapegoat. Despite the years of speculation, one thing remained clear. The murder of Olof Palme had fundamentally changed Sweden. It had shaken the nation's sense of security, forcing its people to confront the reality that even in a peaceful democracy, political violence was possible. The shock of losing a prime minister in such a sudden and brutal manner left scars that would not easily heal. The official case may have been closed, but the truth remained elusive. Many continued to believe that justice had not been served and that somewhere, hidden in the depths of archived files, overlooked testimonies, or forgotten pieces of evidence, the key to solving the mystery still existed. Whether that truth would ever come to light, however, remained one of the greatest uncertainties of all. Despite the official closure of the case, the murder of Olof Palme continued to inspire both public debate and independent investigations. No other unsolved crime in Swedish history had captured the national consciousness in such a profound way. The continued uncertainty left many feeling uneasy, as though an essential part of Sweden's history remained unresolved. As the years passed, journalists, amateur detectives, and conspiracy theorists all worked to unearth new clues, hoping to succeed where the official investigation had failed. One of the most controversial aspects of the case was the role of the Swedish police in the aftermath of the assassination. Many critics argued that the police had been too slow to act, allowing the assassin to escape unhindered. The lack of coordination among law enforcement agencies had resulted in crucial errors, including the failure to secure the crime scene properly and the delayed search for the suspect. These mistakes led some to speculate whether elements within the police force had been complicit in the crime, either through negligence or deliberate obstruction. Adding to the complexity of the case were the conflicting witness statements. Some described seeing a lone gunman fleeing the scene, while others claimed there may have been multiple individuals involved. The composite sketches of the suspect varied significantly, making it difficult to establish a consistent description. Some witnesses recalled seeing a man in a dark coat and hat running down Tunnelgaten, yet others reported spotting suspicious activity in the minutes leading up to the shooting. The discrepancies in these accounts only deepened the mystery. Theories regarding foreign involvement persisted, with some investigators continuing to explore the possibility that Palme had been targeted due to his foreign policy stance. Sweden's role as a mediator in international conflicts, coupled with Palme's outspoken criticism of both the United States and the Soviet Union, had made him a divisive figure on the global stage. His opposition to apartheid in South Africa, in particular, led some to suspect that South African intelligence agencies had orchestrated the attack. While no definitive proof had emerged, the theory remained one of the most plausible explanations for those skeptical of the official narrative. Another theory suggested that Palme's assassination was connected to underground criminal networks. At the time of his death, Sweden was experiencing increasing tensions with organized crime groups, particularly those involved in arms smuggling and drug trafficking. Some believed that Palme had been preparing to crack down on these activities, making him a target for those who stood to lose the most from his continued leadership. However, like many other theories, this one lacked the hard evidence needed to gain widespread acceptance. Meanwhile, forensic experts continued to analyze the few pieces of evidence that remained from the crime scene. The ballistics report had confirmed that Palme had been shot with a .357 Magnum revolver, but with no weapon recovered, it was impossible to match the bullets to a specific gun. The failure to locate the firearm remained one of the most significant barriers to solving the case. Had it been destroyed, hidden away by the real killer, or had it simply been overlooked in the initial investigation? With the case officially closed, frustration among those seeking justice only grew. The decision to name Stig Engström as the likely assassin without concrete evidence struck many as an attempt to wrap up the case without actually solving it. While Engström's behavior on the night of the murder had raised questions, the lack of forensic or eyewitness evidence linking him directly to the crime meant that doubts remained. Many believed that the authorities had simply chosen the most convenient suspect rather than the correct one. Even decades after the assassination, Sweden continued to feel the impact of Palme's death. The event had not only altered the country's political landscape, but had also shaken public confidence in law enforcement and the judicial system. The inability to solve the case left a lingering sense of vulnerability, a reminder that even in one of the world's most peaceful nations, political violence could strike at any moment. As independent researchers and journalists pushed forward, the hope remained that new evidence might one day come to light. Perhaps a long-suppressed document would surface, revealing critical information. Perhaps a witness, after years of silence, would decide to speak out. Or perhaps, with advances in forensic science, a new technology could unlock clues that had previously gone unnoticed. Until that day arrived, the assassination of Olof Palme would remain one of modern history's most enduring mysteries, a case that refused to be forgotten. As the decades passed, the assassination of Olof Palme remained an open wound in Sweden's history. While the authorities had officially closed the case, declaring Stig Engström the likely killer, the public remained divided. Many found the conclusion unsatisfying, believing that the truth had been buried beneath years of mismanagement, lost evidence, and ignored leads. Even though the case had been legally closed, it was far from resolved in the minds of many Swedes. One of the most puzzling aspects of the case remained the motive. If Engström had indeed been the murderer, what had driven him to carry out such a bold and politically charged crime? Unlike typical assassins, Engström had no clear ties to extremist groups or criminal organizations. He was known as a man who sought attention, but was he truly capable of carrying out a cold-blooded assassination without leaving behind concrete evidence? Many critics pointed out that Engström's known behavior didn't match that of a professional killer. He had willingly inserted himself into the investigation, giving multiple conflicting statements to the police and the media. If he had been the assassin, why had he acted in a way that almost ensured scrutiny? His apparent recklessness led some to believe he had been a scapegoat rather than the real perpetrator. Beyond Engström, other suspects continued to be debated. One of the longest-standing theories was that Palme had been targeted due to his involvement in international diplomacy and his outspoken political views. His opposition to apartheid in South Africa had earned him powerful enemies, and some suspected that foreign intelligence agencies could have orchestrated his murder. Sweden's role in arms deals, particularly with countries involved in Cold War conflicts, also raised suspicions that Palme may have been silenced for reasons that extended beyond domestic politics. Despite these theories, no direct link to foreign agencies was ever found. The possibility of a domestic conspiracy also remained a popular theory. Some believed that rogue elements within Sweden's own security services had played a role in the assassination. There had been reports of dissatisfaction within the police and military regarding Palme's policies, with some members believing he was weakening Sweden's national security. If such a conspiracy had existed, it was plausible that key evidence had been suppressed early in the investigation, leading to the many inconsistencies and errors that plagued the case. As forensic science advanced, many wondered whether new technology could provide long-awaited answers. DNA analysis had solved cases decades after crimes had occurred, and advances in ballistics testing had identified long-lost murder weapons. However, in the case of Palme, much of the physical evidence had either been lost, compromised, or was too minimal to be of use. The missing murder weapon was a significant obstacle. Without it, a definitive forensic link to any suspect was nearly impossible. Investigators had examined hundreds of revolvers over the years, but none were found to be a match. The possibility remained that the weapon had been disposed of in a way that ensured it would never be found, or that it was still out there, waiting to be discovered. Despite these challenges, Sweden's interest in the case remained strong. The murder had not only shaped the country's political landscape, but had also led to changes in how major investigations were handled. The failures in the Palme case prompted reforms within the police force and judicial system, ensuring that future high-profile cases would be managed with greater efficiency and accuracy. However, for many, these improvements were little consolation when the biggest question, who killed Olof Palme, remained unanswered. The closure of the official investigation did not mean the end of the search for truth. Journalists, researchers, and independent investigators continued their work, uncovering new information and questioning old conclusions. Some believed that an overlooked piece of evidence or a witness who had remained silent for decades could one day break the case wide open. Others were less optimistic, fearing that the real story had been permanently buried beneath years of political maneuvering and investigative missteps. As time moved forward, the memory of Olof Palme's assassination remained deeply ingrained in Sweden's history. The unanswered questions, the flawed investigation, and the many theories surrounding the case ensured that it would never truly fade from public consciousness. The truth, whatever it may be, remained just out of reach, a mystery that, even after decades, refused to be forgotten. As the years continued to pass, the assassination of Olof Palme remained an enduring mystery that refused to be laid to rest. Though the official investigation had named Stig Engström as the likely culprit, public skepticism persisted. There were too many loose ends, too many unanswered questions, and too many alternative theories that had never been thoroughly explored. For many, the case represented more than just the loss of a leader. It was a symbol of institutional failure, a reminder of how justice can sometimes slip through the cracks. One of the biggest concerns among skeptics was the timing of the case's closure. After decades of investigation, why had the authorities chosen to name Engström as the likely perpetrator without definitive evidence? Some suspected that political and institutional pressures had played a role. The Swedish police had spent over 30 years investigating the case, pouring massive resources into solving it. By declaring Engström the likely assassin, they could finally close the books on the case and move forward. But was this truly justice or simply a convenient conclusion? Many critics pointed out that Engström had not been taken seriously as a suspect during the initial investigation. His erratic behavior, conflicting statements, and willingness to place himself at the scene raised suspicions, but there was no solid forensic evidence linking him to the crime. The lack of DNA, fingerprints, or the murder weapon meant that the case against him remained circumstantial at best. If he had been involved, had he acted alone? Or had he been part of a larger conspiracy that had yet to be uncovered? One of the most perplexing aspects of the case was the absence of clear motive. While Engström was known for his dislike of Palme's political stance, there was little evidence to suggest that he had the means or determination to carry out such a high-profile assassination. Many political assassinations throughout history had been committed by extremists with clear ideological motivations or operatives working for powerful organizations. Engström did not fit either profile, which led some to believe that he had been chosen as a scapegoat rather than the true killer. Meanwhile, alternative theories continued to flourish. Some researchers remained convinced that Palme's murder had been orchestrated by a foreign intelligence agency, particularly those in South Africa or the United States. Palme's vocal opposition to apartheid had made him a target for South African security forces, while his neutral stance during the Cold War had drawn suspicion from both Western and Eastern blocs. If the assassination had been a professional hit, it would explain the clean execution, the rapid disappearance of the perpetrator, and the lack of physical evidence left behind. Others speculated that Palme had been targeted by domestic right-wing extremists. Reports had surfaced in the years following the assassination suggesting that elements within Sweden's own security forces had harbored deep resentment toward Palme's policies. If members of the police or military had been involved, it would also explain the numerous missteps in the investigation. Perhaps some of them had not been accidental, but rather deliberate acts of obstruction. Despite these lingering doubts, the official closure of the case meant that many avenues of investigation were no longer being actively pursued. The Swedish government had declared the case solved, and while independent researchers and journalists continued to probe into the details, the likelihood of a breakthrough seemed increasingly slim. The passage of time had taken its toll. Many key witnesses had passed away, memories had faded, and crucial evidence had either been lost or was no longer viable for forensic testing. Still, for those who had followed the case for decades, the idea of letting it rest was unthinkable. Some continued to push for new inquiries, arguing that modern forensic techniques and artificial intelligence could potentially reveal connections that had been missed in earlier investigations. Others held out hope that a long-hidden piece of evidence would one day surface, finally shedding light on one of the greatest mysteries of modern European history. As Sweden moved forward, the assassination of Olof Palme remained an unresolved chapter in its national story. While his legacy as a leader continued to be honored, the truth behind his death remained elusive. For many, the case was a reminder that even in the most stable and democratic societies, there are shadows where justice struggles to reach. The search for answers was not just about finding Palme's killer. It was about upholding the principle that no crime, no matter how complex, should remain forever unsolved. As the years continued to pass, the case of Olof Palme's assassination transformed from an active investigation into a historical mystery. While the official conclusion named Stig Engström as the likely perpetrator, skepticism remained widespread. Researchers, journalists, and independent investigators refused to accept the final verdict, believing that too many questions remained unanswered. The lingering doubts surrounding Palme's death had ensured that the case remained a subject of discussion, both in Sweden and internationally. One of the most enduring frustrations surrounding the investigation was the failure to locate the murder weapon. The .357 Magnum revolver used in the assassination had never been found, despite extensive searches and appeals to the public. Without the weapon, forensic experts had been unable to definitively link any suspect to the crime. The lack of physical evidence left investigators relying solely on witness testimony and circumstantial leads, which had only fueled the many conflicting theories about the case. For some, the most plausible explanation remained the theory that foreign intelligence agencies had been involved. Palme's strong political stance on global issues, particularly his opposition to apartheid in South Africa, had earned him powerful enemies. Some researchers continued to explore the idea that South African intelligence operatives, fearing Palme's influence on international sanctions, had orchestrated his murder. However, without hard evidence, this theory remained speculative. Another theory that refused to die was the possibility of a right-wing conspiracy within Sweden itself. Palme had been a divisive figure, with many within the Swedish police and military harboring resentment toward his policies. Over the years, whistleblowers and investigative journalists had uncovered reports suggesting that extremist elements within Swedish law enforcement had discussed the idea of removing Palme from power. Whether or not such discussions had led to actual plans for assassination was still unknown, but for those who believed in this theory, it explained many of the early investigative failures and inconsistencies in the police response. Public distrust in the police's handling of the case had only deepened in the years following the assassination. Many Swedes believed that had the crime scene been secured properly, key evidence might have been preserved. The slow response from law enforcement on the night of the murder had also raised questions. Why had roadblocks not been set up immediately? Why had no organized manhunt been launched in the immediate hours following the shooting? These missteps only fueled suspicions that the investigation had either been compromised or intentionally mismanaged. Despite these doubts, the Swedish government remained firm in its stance that the case was closed. The naming of Stig Engström as the likely assassin had provided authorities with a way to finally put the decades-long investigation to rest. However, for those who had closely followed the case, this resolution felt inadequate. The lack of a trial, forensic proof, or a direct confession meant that, in their eyes, justice had not truly been served. As technology advanced, some researchers held on to hope that new forensic techniques might one day provide an answer. DNA analysis had solved decades-old cases in other parts of the world, leading some to wonder if the same could happen with the Palme case. However, without preserved biological evidence or the murder weapon, the chances of such a breakthrough remained slim. Some investigators even turned to artificial intelligence, using data analysis to re-evaluate witness testimonies and timelines in hopes of identifying inconsistencies that had previously been overlooked. The continued fascination with Palme's assassination was not just about finding his killer. It was about uncovering the truth. The case had become a symbol of both political intrigue and investigative failure. For Sweden, a country that prided itself on justice and transparency, the inability to conclusively solve the murder of its prime minister remained a deep national wound. As time moved forward, the likelihood of new revelations seemed to dwindle, but for many, the hope remained that one day, a long-buried clue, a forgotten testimony, or an unexpected confession might finally bring the case to its true conclusion. Until then, the murder of Olof Palme remained an enduring enigma, a dark chapter in Sweden's history that refused to close completely. The passage of time had done little to diminish the mystery surrounding Olof Palme's assassination. Decades had gone by, yet the case continued to spark debates, theories, and new investigations by those unwilling to accept the official narrative. The unanswered questions loomed large. Who had truly been behind the assassination? Why had so many investigative failures occurred? And was there still a chance that a hidden truth could one day emerge? One of the key issues that kept researchers and journalists engaged with the case was the undeniable presence of inconsistencies. From the very first moments following the shooting, the response from Swedish authorities had been unusually chaotic. Law enforcement's delayed reaction had allowed the killer to disappear without a trace, and the crime scene had not been secured properly. These failures, intentional or not, had set the stage for a decades-long struggle to find the truth. Many who doubted the official conclusion regarding Stig Engström believed that he had been used as a convenient suspect rather than a genuine perpetrator. His conflicting statements and erratic behavior had certainly raised suspicions, but skeptics pointed out that he had no history of violent behavior, no known expertise with firearms, and no clear political motive that would justify such an act. If he had indeed pulled the trigger, had he acted alone? Or had he been manipulated into taking the fall for a much larger conspiracy? The conspiracy theories surrounding Palme's death were numerous, with some continuing to suggest foreign intelligence involvement. Palme's independent approach to global diplomacy had made him unpopular with certain world powers. Had a foreign government orchestrated his assassination? Theories involving South African intelligence, the CIA, or even the KGB had been explored over the years, but no definitive proof had surfaced to support these claims. Another theory that refused to fade was the possibility of a domestic conspiracy. Right-wing elements within Sweden, including some members of law enforcement and the military, had long viewed Palme as a dangerous radical whose policies threatened national stability. If these factions had been involved, it would explain why the investigation had faced so many setbacks and why crucial evidence seemed to vanish when it was most needed. Despite the Swedish government's official declaration that the case had been solved with the naming of Engström as the likely suspect, many found the resolution unsatisfactory. Unlike many solved cold cases where forensic evidence, confessions, or eyewitness testimonies confirmed the identity of the perpetrator, the Palme case remained deeply circumstantial. There was no DNA, no murder weapon, and no direct evidence linking Engström to the crime beyond inconsistencies in his own statements. For a case of this magnitude, such an explanation felt incomplete. The continued interest in the assassination was not just about seeking justice for Palme, it was about accountability. The case had become a symbol of how an investigation, if mishandled, could lead to decades of uncertainty. Sweden prided itself on its strong judicial system, yet the inability to solve the country's most high-profile murder remained a glaring exception. As technology advanced, some researchers held out hope that breakthroughs in forensic science could one day provide answers. Could advancements in artificial intelligence or data analysis uncover new insights from the thousands of files, testimonies, and reports compiled over the years? If new evidence emerged, perhaps a long-forgotten document or a previously overlooked witness statement, could it change the course of history? Despite the uncertainties, one thing was clear. Olof Palme's assassination would never fully fade from Sweden's collective memory. It remained an event that had shaped the nation's history, a moment that had exposed vulnerabilities within its institutions and challenged the idea that justice was always attainable. Whether the truth would ever be revealed remained an open question, but for those who continued to search, the case was far from closed. As the decades passed, the case of Olof Palme's assassination continued to haunt Sweden. The country had moved on politically, but the ghost of that cold February night in 1986 lingered. While Stig Engström had been officially named as the likely perpetrator, the lack of concrete evidence meant that many still viewed the case as unresolved. Investigative journalists, amateur detectives, and historians continued their relentless pursuit of the truth, refusing to accept an answer that felt more like a convenient conclusion rather than definitive justice. For those who still doubted the official explanation, the fundamental question remained. If Engström had not been the killer, then who had been? And if he had been responsible, had he truly acted alone? These lingering doubts kept the case alive in the public consciousness, ensuring that theories, both reasonable and extreme, continued to circulate. One major issue that kept the case open in the minds of the public was the failure to locate the murder weapon. The .357 Magnum revolver that had ended Palme's life remained one of the most significant missing pieces of evidence. Over the years, authorities had examined hundreds of similar weapons, but none matched the ballistics from the crime scene. If the gun had been destroyed or hidden beyond discovery, then the final piece of forensic evidence that could have truly solved the case had been lost forever. Some theorists believed that the weapon had been deliberately disposed of by someone within law enforcement or intelligence services to cover up the real culprit's identity. Beyond the forensic evidence, inconsistencies in witness testimonies continued to frustrate investigators. Some accounts described a single gunman fleeing the scene, while others suggested that additional figures had been present in the area at the time of the shooting. The discrepancies in these reports fueled the belief that Palme's assassination had been more than just an impulsive act by a lone individual. Some researchers speculated that if there had been co-conspirators, They might have helped the assassin escape, or even played a role in planning the murder. One of the most compelling alternative theories remained the possibility of foreign involvement. Palme's political stance had made him an international figure, and he had gained enemies in powerful places. His opposition to apartheid in South Africa, his criticisms of U.S. foreign policy, and his independent diplomatic initiatives had earned him both admiration and hostility. If foreign operatives had carried out the assassination, they would have had the resources and experience to execute the crime flawlessly and disappear without a trace. However, there was still no smoking gun, no intercepted communication, no credible whistleblower testimony, and no physical evidence linking any foreign agency to the assassination. The absence of such proof made this theory difficult to prove, but equally difficult to dismiss. Meanwhile, for many Swedes, the unanswered questions surrounding Palme's murder had become a symbol of something larger. The limits of law enforcement, the imperfections of justice, and the realization that even in a stable democracy, there were forces that operated beyond the reach of accountability. The failures of the initial investigation, the delayed response from the police, and the numerous inconsistencies had led many to question whether their government had done everything possible to solve the case, or if, at some level, forces within the system had obstructed the truth. As time went on, Sweden had to confront an uncomfortable reality. The case of Olof Palme's assassination might never be definitively solved. The trail had grown cold, key witnesses had passed away, and critical evidence had been lost to time. Even if new information surfaced, it was unlikely that it would be enough to overturn the official conclusion or lead to a conviction in a court of law. Still, those dedicated to the case refused to give up hope. Some believed that in the digital age, artificial intelligence and advanced forensic technologies could unlock patterns or connections that had gone unnoticed in earlier investigations. Others hoped that someone somewhere still held the missing piece of the puzzle, a document, a memory, a confession, that could one day shed light on what truly happened that night in 1986. As Sweden moved forward, Palme's legacy remained intact. He was remembered as a bold leader, a man unafraid to challenge powerful forces, and a politician who had left a lasting mark on the world stage. Yet the unresolved nature of his death left an unsettling question mark over his story, a reminder that even the most thorough investigations can fall short, and even the most powerful figures can disappear into history without a clear answer to their fate. As the years continued to pass, the case of Olof Palme's assassination slowly transitioned from an ongoing investigation into a permanent enigma. With the official inquiry closed, and the Swedish authorities naming Stig Engström as the likely perpetrator, the world was expected to accept that justice had been served. Yet, for many, the doubts and questions surrounding the case were simply too great to ignore. The lack of forensic evidence remained one of the most troubling aspects of the case. In most high-profile assassinations, investigators relied on ballistic analysis, DNA samples, or concrete physical links to bring a perpetrator to justice. However, in the case of Palme's murder, none of these elements had been found. The missing .357 Magnum revolver, the absence of fingerprints, and the failure to conclusively place Engström at the scene meant that the case could never be definitively closed in the minds of many Swedes. The official conclusion, that Engström had acted alone, was not universally accepted. Many still questioned how an individual with no known experience in firearms or political extremism could have planned and executed such a high-profile assassination, evaded capture, and remained unnoticed for decades. If Engström was truly guilty, why had the investigation taken so long to reach that conclusion? And if he was innocent, had the real perpetrator escaped justice forever? As time progressed, more theories emerged. Some theorists believed that the real assassin had been someone unknown to the public, a figure who had managed to disappear into obscurity. Others speculated that Palme's death had been the result of a much larger plot, one involving multiple conspirators who had carefully planned and covered up their crime. The idea that a single individual could have carried out such an audacious act without help seemed, to many, highly unlikely. Beyond the specifics of the case, Palme's assassination had left a deeper impact on Sweden itself. It was a stark reminder that even in one of the most peaceful and politically stable countries in the world, no leader was immune to violence. The event had changed Sweden's approach to security, leading to increased protection for political figures and a re-evaluation of the nation's justice system. The investigation itself became a case study in forensic science and law enforcement, serving as an example of how crucial early mistakes could hinder justice for decades. Despite these changes, the emotional weight of the case never fully lifted. Each anniversary of Palme's death brought renewed discussion, fresh speculation, and continued frustration from those who believed that the true answers remained hidden. Documentaries, books, and investigative reports kept the case alive in the public imagination, ensuring that Palme's name would never be forgotten. For the people of Sweden, the case symbolized both a tragedy and a challenge, an unsolved mystery that stood as a testament to the complexities of justice. While some had come to accept that they might never know the full truth, others still hoped that one day, a missing piece of evidence, a long-overlooked clue, or even a deathbed confession might finally provide the answers they had sought for so long. Until that moment arrived, the assassination of Olof Palme would remain a chapter of history left open, a wound that never truly healed, and a question that would continue to echo through Sweden's collective memory. For now, the truth remained elusive, lost somewhere between speculation and certainty, waiting to be uncovered, if it ever would be.